There is a warning system operating in your backyard right now, and you have never once consciously listened to it. It is not subtle. It is loud, specific, and constantly broadcasting. Yet almost every person on Earth has trained themselves to hear it as background noise. Garden birds are not just chirping at random. They are running an early warning network sophisticated enough to encode the exact size of an approaching predator. Sophisticated enough to be understood by species that don't even speak the same call, and in at least one documented case, sophisticated enough to detect a deadly storm system that was still hundreds of miles away. What you've been calling birdsong might actually be the most reliable danger broadcast happening on your property. Stay with me, because once you understand what's encoded in those calls, you will never tune them out again. Picture an ordinary afternoon at a backyard feeder. Chickadees hop between branches, calling their familiar two-note song, the one most people associate with their name, chick-a-d-d-d. It sounds cheerful. It sounds harmless. It sounds like exactly the kind of background noise you stop registering after the first 30 seconds. But somewhere in that sequence of notes is a piece of tactical information being transmitted in real time, and the bird delivering it is not singing for pleasure. It is reporting, it is naming a threat, describing its size, and broadcasting that description to every creature within earshot capable of understanding the code. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. You're standing right there. And you have no idea the report is even happening. 4 décades. The scientific assumption was that bird calls were relatively simple. A handful of fixed signals, meaning roughly danger, food, or mate available, with little nuance beyond that. That assumption did not survive contact with serious experimental research. In 2005, a team led by Christopher Templeton, working with biologist Eric Green at the University of Montana, set out to test something that sounded almost too precise to be true. Did the chickadee call actually vary depending on the predator it was responding to? They exposed wild chickadees to 15 different species of live predators, ranging from massive, slow-moving owls to small, agile, far more dangerous raptors, and recorded thousands of resulting alarm calls for acoustic analysis. What they found rewrote the conversation around how much information birds are actually capable of packing into sound. The chickadees were not producing one generic alarm call. They were modifying the call itself in measurable, repeatable ways. based on exactly how dangerous the predator in front of them actually was. And the variable doing the heavy lifting was something almost absurdly simple. Number of D notes tacked onto the end of the call. Think about that phrase for a second. Chickadee, count the Ds. According to the published results, a slow, clumsy predator, like a great horned owl. Large, easy to spot. Easy to avoid, triggered relatively few D notes, but a small, fast, highly lethal hunter like a pygmy owl. A predator that can slip through brush and ambush a chickadee, almost without warning. Triggered something else entirely. Researchers recorded calls with as many as 23 D notes stacked onto a single alarm sequence in response to that specific threat. Read that again. 23. Not because the bird was more frightened in some vague emotional sense, but because the call itself was encoding threat level with what amounts to a graduated alarm scale. More DIS, more danger, smaller, and more lethal. The predator actually is. This is not coincidence. This is not noise. This is structured communication with a built-in severity rating, broadcast constantly from the branches above your head, and almost nobody walking past has ever known to listen for the difference between a 4D call and a 15D call, and it gets more specific than just counting notes. The same research demonstrated that chickadees use an entirely separate call type, depending on whether the threat is moving through the air or sitting still. A high, thin, almost ghostly seat call is reserved specifically for flying raptors, hawks, falcons, anything actively hunting on the wing. A threat that demands instant, silent, evasive behavior rather than a loud group response that might draw the predator's attention. The loud chickadee call, the one with the variable D count, gets deployed for stationary or perched predators. A hawk resting in a nearby tree, an owl tucked into a roost, even a domestic cat crouched in the grass. That second call type isn't just a warning, it's a recruitment signal. It's the chickadee equivalent of calling for backup, summoning other birds to converge on the threat and mob it collectively until it leaves. So already, before we've even left a single species, you're looking at a communication system with at least two distinct call categories, a built-in severity scale measured in repeated syllables, and a functional difference between evade quietly and everyone converge now. That alone should change how you think about the soundtrack of your own backyard. But here's where the story stops being about one clever species and starts becoming something closer to an entire interconnected surveillance network, because chickadees are not keeping this information to themselves. In a follow-up study published in 2007, the same researcher, Eric Green, working again with Christopher Templeton, turned their attention to a completely different bird species sharing the same habitat. The red-breasted nuthatches don't speak chickadee. They have their own calls, their own vocal repertoire, their own way of communicating within their own species. And yet the experiment found something that should genuinely unsettle anyone who's ever assumed birds operate as isolated little broadcasting units, deaf to everything outside their own kind. Nuthatches were listening to chickadee alarm calls, decoding the subtle acoustic differences between them, and adjusting their own behavior accordingly without ever having produced a call themselves, without speaking the language natively, simply by eavesdropping on a neighboring species' warning system and extracting the threat information embedded inside it. This is not a small detail. This means the chickadee's alarm call isn't just a private internal signal for chickadees. It is functioning as a kind of shared regional broadcast, a public warning channel that other species have evolved the ability to tap into and interpret correctly, in real time, without any direct evolutionary relationship requiring them to do so. Somewhere in your yard right now, multiple species that don't share a native language are nonetheless reading each other's warning calls with enough precision to extract specific threat level data. Think about what that actually implies about the density of information moving through what most people dismiss as ambient birdsong. It is not ambient, it is a live feed. You've simply never had the decoder. And once you start pulling on this thread, the network only gets wider. Other research building on these foundational chickadee studies has shown that several species of warblers and a range of other songbirds will respond to chickadee mobbing calls, even when no chickadee is visible, meaning the call alone, transmitted through dense brush or across an open lawn, is enough to trigger a defensive response in species that never directly witnessed the predator at all. A predator doesn't need to be seen by every bird in the area to be reported to every bird in the area. One accurate observer, one well-placed cicada with a clear line of sight on a perched hawk, can functionally broadcast that threat across an entire mixed species flock within seconds, and every species capable of decoding the alarm gets the warning whether they earned it through their own vigilance or not. This is not a handful of isolated alarm calls happening to overlap. This is a distributed sensor network, running constantly, with multiple species acting as both transmitters and receivers, depending on who spots the danger first. Now here is where the story escalates into territory that goes far beyond predator detection, because everything you've just learned about chickadee alarm calls describes a system built to respond to immediate, visible, close-range danger. A hawk in a tree, a cat in the grass, a threat that can be seen and named within seconds. What researchers discovered next suggests that some birds are running an entirely separate warning system, one that doesn't require the danger to be visible at all. One that can detect catastrophic threats while they are still hundreds of miles away and completely undetectable to any human, standing in the same location. In the spring of 2014, a research team led by ecologist Henry then working through the University of California, Berkeley, was in the middle of an entirely unrelated study. They had fitted a population of golden-winged warblers nesting in the Cumberland Mountains of eastern Tennessee with small geolocator tags, devices designed to track the birds' movement patterns over the course of a full year, primarily to study migration. It was meant to be a quiet, technical piece of long-term field biology. Then, in late April of that year, something happened in the data that made no sense at all, and the explanation researchers eventually settled on would go on to be described in the journal Current Biology as one of the most striking examples of pre-storm sensing ever documented in a wild bird. The geolocator data showed that a cluster of these warblers had abruptly abandoned their breeding territory they had only just claimed, territory they would normally defend and remain on through the entire breeding season, and flown hundreds of miles south toward the Gulf Coast. This is not normal behavior. Golden-winged warblers, once they arrive at a breeding ground and stake a claim, do not casually leave. Establishing and defending breeding territory is one of the most energetically expensive things a small songbird does in its entire year, and abandoning it mid-season represents a massive, costly gamble. The researchers initially assumed that geolocators had malfunctioned, that the data was simply wrong. They checked, the data held up. The birds had genuinely left, so they went looking for an explanation, and what they found waiting for them in the weather record was almost cinematic in its timing. The storm system the warblers had apparently fled from was not a minor weather event. It was the same massive supercell outbreak that tore through the central and southern United States that spring. A system that would go on to generate 84 confirmed tornadoes and kill at least 35 people. And the warblers hadn't waited until the storm was close enough to see, hear, or feel in any conventional sense. According to the published data, the birds left their breeding grounds 1 to 2 full days before the supercell arrived, at a point when the storm system itself was still somewhere between 250 and 550 miles away. Local weather conditions, at the exact moment the birds departed, were completely normal. No wind, no darkening sky, no barometric collapse a human observer would have noticed standing in that same patch of forest. This is the part of the story that should genuinely stop you. These are birds weighing roughly the equivalent of 2 nickels, detecting and responding to a deadly storm system that was still days away and hundreds of miles distant, using cues no human in that forest could perceive at all. So, what were they actually sensing? The leading explanation researchers have put forward involves something called extremely low-frequency sound waves, well below the threshold of human hearing, that violent storm systems are known to generate in enormous quantities. Tornadic supercells produce infrasound that can travel for thousands of kilometers before fully dissipating, effects meteorologists and physicists have understood for decades in an entirely different context, studying storm systems rather than animal behavior. What the 2014 Warbler study suggested, for the first time with this level of direct evidence, is that birds may be tuned into that same infrasonic signal as an early warning system, picking up the storm's acoustic footprint from a distance. No visual or barometric cue could explain on its own. Think about what that means for a second, because it deserves more than a passing mention. Somewhere in that Tennessee forest, in a population of small songbirds, going about an entirely ordinary breeding season, There existed the biological equivalent of a long-range storm detection system, one that, in this specific case, outperformed the layperson's ability to predict the same event by a full day or more. The birds didn't wait for the sky to change color. They didn't wait for the wind to pick up. They left while everything around them still looked completely, deceptively calm, because something in their physiology was already registering. A threat that hadn't yet become visible to anyone or anything else in that ecosystem. And here's where it gets worse. In the sense that it should make you respect this more rather than less. This detection apparently cost them. Researchers noted that the round-trip detour some of these birds made covered well over 500 miles. An enormous, energetically punishing diversion in the middle of a breeding season. Already stretched thin by the demands of territory defense and nesting, they paid a real biological price to act on a signal humans can't even perceive existing. An infrasound detection of distant storms isn't the only sensing system layered into ordinary backyard birds. There's a second, quieter mechanism running constantly, one that doesn't require a catastrophic tornado outbreak to activate. It responds to something far more mundane and far more frequent. The gradual decline in barometric pressure that precedes almost every storm system, from a violent supercell down to an unremarkable afternoon thunderstorm. Researchers at Western University's Advanced Facility for Avian Research designed an experiment specifically to isolate this variable, placing birds inside a controlled environment where temperature, light, and air pressure could each be manipulated independently. In one version of the test, just before a simulated dawn, researchers quietly dropped the air pressure inside the chamber to mimic an approaching storm without changing the temperature, without changing the light, without giving the birds any other sensory cue that anything had shifted. The result was immediate and almost eerie in its precision. Under ordinary conditions, a bird waking at dawn goes through a fairly predictable sequence, a bit of preening, some hopping around, a general settling in period before it gets serious about feeding. But the moment the simulated lights came on after that quiet pressure drop, the birds skipped the routine entirely and went straight to eating, as if some internal alarm had already told them that food access was about to become unreliable and they needed to bank calories immediately. Separate. Related study on white-crowned sparrows found the same underlying pattern. Declining barometric pressure measurably increased feeding behavior even when nothing else in the environment had changed, confirming that small songbirds carry something functionally close to an internal barometer. A built-in pressure sensor wired directly into feeding decisions that activates well before any storm becomes visible, audible, or otherwise detectable by a human standing in the same space. Now put these three systems next to each other and really sit with the combined picture. Because each one on its own is impressive, but stacked together they describe something closer to layered, redundant early warning infrastructure than to a handful of isolated quirks. There is a short-range system built around variable alarm calls, capable of identifying a specific predator's size and danger level within seconds, and broadcasting that information, not just to other members of the same species, but to an entire mixed community of birds fluent enough in each other's signals to react correctly without ever seeing the threat themselves. There is a long-range system built around infrasonic detection, capable of identifying a catastrophic, life-threatening storm while it is still days away and hundreds of miles distant, with enough lead time to trigger a costly evacuation long before any conventional sign of danger appears. And there is a continuous background system built around barometric sensing, constantly monitoring atmospheric pressure and adjusting feeding behavior in real time as conditions shift. Hours or even a day before a storm's arrival becomes obvious to anyone without that internal gauge. None of these systems require consciousness in the way humans experience it. None of them require the bird to understand danger the way a person understands a tornado warning on a phone screen, but functionally, mechanically, in terms of what they actually accomplish. These systems are doing something humans spent enormous amounts of money and decades of technological development trying to replicate. Doppler radar networks, seismic and acoustic monitoring stations, satellite-based storm tracking. Entire branches of applied physics and meteorology exist specifically to give human populations the kind of advance warning that a 5-gram warbler may be getting for free, wired directly into its nervous system by evolutionary pressures stretching back millions of years. We built billion-dollar infrastructure to approximate something a chickadee and a warbler are doing constantly, automatically, without any infrastructure at all. So what does this actually mean for you? Standing in your own backyard, half listening to a feeder full of birds you've never thought twice about. It means the next time the volume and pattern of alarm calls outside your window suddenly shifts more denotes than usual. A sharp seed call cutting through what had been ordinary chatter. An unfamiliar urgency in birds that are normally calm. That shift is not random noise. It is potentially specific. Decodable information about exactly what kind of threat has just entered the area and how dangerous that threat is, judged to be by the animal that spotted it first. And it means that on the rare afternoon when birds at your feeders suddenly go into a frantic, almost aggressive feeding frenzy under a sky that still looks completely clear, that behavior may not be random either. It may be the visible tail end of an internal pressure sensor that detected a shift in the atmosphere long before any cloud formed on the horizon, an early translation of a storm system you won't be able to see for hours. Here's where this gets uncomfortable in a different way, because none of these warning systems exist in isolation from the broader pressures currently reshaping bird populations across North America. A communication network built on multiple species correctly interpreting each other's alarm calls only functions if there are enough individuals of enough different species living in close enough proximity for those signals to actually be heard, decoded, and acted upon. A mixed flock with a chickadee, a nuthatch, a titmouse, and a handful of warblers moving through the same patch of habitat creates a dense, overlapping web of eyes, ears, and decoders, each species adding redundancy to the system. Each one capable of catching a threat the others might miss. Thin that, web out, fewer species, fewer individuals, more fragmented habitat with longer gaps between viable territory. And you don't just lose individual birds, you potentially degrade the warning network itself, leaving the birds that remain with fewer neighbors capable of confirming a threat, fewer independent observers feeding information into the same shared channel. That should reframe how you think about every bird you do still see at your feeder. It is not simply an individual animal going about its day. It is one active node in a layered, partially redundant, multi-species detection grid that has been quietly running in the background of human civilization for as long as birds and humans have shared the same landscapes, a grid most people have never consciously tapped into. Despite living within constant earshot of its broadcasts, the question this leaves hanging, the one researchers are still actively chasing, is how much more of this network remains completely undocumented. If chickadees can encode predator size in the number of syllables in a call, if nuthatches can borrow that information without speaking the same acoustic dialect, if a 5-gram warbler can detect a deadly storm system from hundreds of miles away using a sense humans don't naturally have access to at all, what other signals are moving through your backyard right now, encoded in calls, in feeding patterns, in flight height, in the subtle timing of a morning chorus that no study has yet thought to test for? And there's a deeper, more unsettling layer underneath even that question. These detection systems evolved over an almost unimaginable stretch of time, calibrated against threats and storm patterns that have existed in relatively stable form for millennia. Climate volatility is now changing the frequency, intensity, and unpredictability of the very storm systems these birds are apparently built to sense in advance. Does an evolved infrasound detection system calibrated against historical storm behavior still function with the same reliability against a shifting, increasingly erratic climate? Or does the warning system itself begin to lag behind the threat it was built to anticipate? Nobody currently has a confident answer to that question, and it may be years before enough data exists to even attempt one. What is clear, right now, today, is that the birds outside your window are running communication and detection systems more sophisticated than almost anyone walking past them has ever paused to consider. And the next time their calls shift in tone, in repetition, in urgency, you will at least know enough to ask what exactly they might be trying to tell you, and whether you're going to keep tuning it out or finally start listening for the warning underneath the noise.